Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the 115th K-Core Zoom presentation. We have with us today Julian Cribb from Australia. The second time in the last couple of months that he has given us a talk. I hope you all remember his first one because it was fascinating. I think this one should be as well. This is about the age of renewable food. So over to you, Julian.
Ooh, it says it's having trouble loading my feed at the moment. I'm not sure why. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure to be with you again. Some of you may recall that in my last talk, I discussed the 10 megathreats which comprise the human existential crisis. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of those megathreats, which is the threat to the world food supply and what we can do about it. So starting at the beginning, we've got this terrific imbalance between demand for food and now the constraints that are coming on it. I mean, basically, the population's still going up by around about 80 million people a year. It's not just babies being born, it's also old folk living longer lives. Because somebody in a country like Canada or Australia eats 35,000 more meals in their lifetime than somebody in West Africa. That's just simply the difference in life expectancy, right? So now we're on track for, well, 8 billion people this November, 10 billion people in the 2050s, and possibly 11 billion by the end of the century if we keep going at the current rates. Meat demand is soaring throughout the newly industrialized countries like China. Anywhere that's getting rich eats meat. And basically food demand overall, certainly protein-wise, is likely to double by the 2060s. Up against that, we've got the fact that the world is now out of water. I'll talk some more about that. We're running out of soil. There are limits to how much energy we can use because food production produces 30% of the climate emissions. So, you know, we've really got to get control of that. We've got limited supplies, both of phosphorus and, as Canada would know, of potash. We've hit peak fish in the oceans already. The oceans are running out of fish. There's very little money being put into finding better ways to grow food or produce food. Even though we're looking at, you know, a real crunch point now, there's not enough money going into agriculture, far too much going into other things. And of course, the climate in which agriculture was born is extinct, and more on that anon. Okay, well, peak water. I mean, basically everywhere you look, we're running out of water. We're running out of surface water. Rivers and lakes are drying up. In Hubei province in China, the province of 1,000 lakes, there are only 100 lakes left. You know, they've all been drained and cleared and built on and things like that. And that's true worldwide. That's a picture of the Colorado River on the right there, but you could take the same picture of the Murray-Darling in Australia. And you can currently take the same picture in the Rhine, the Danube, the Loire, and quite a number of famous rivers are looking a bit like that. So this is just cumulative human pressure and water demand, as well as climate change. It's not just the climate. Lake Chad is a classic case. Something like 90% of that lake has vanished in the last 30 years, and it supports 40 million people. You know, there's a decent number of people dependent on that lake, both for its agricultural and its fish resources. So, you know, big lakes like that disappearing are a real problem. And of course, we've got the shrinking glaciers up in the high mountains all around the world. The Indonesian glaciers, for example, are just about gone now, but they're shrinking in Europe, they're shrinking in the Himalaya, they're shrinking in the Rockies, you name it. Okay, well, soil is in just as bad a plight as water. Basically, we've lost a third of the world's topsoil since the 1970s. That's Sheffield University saying that, not me. Heavily cropped soils. And you've got to bear in mind that some soils, like the Indo-Gangetic Plains, have been farmed for 4,000 years. So they are very depleted in micronutrients. So anywhere that's been farmed for a good long time, the micronutrient level is way down. And especially when you add fertilizer, the plants then mine the micronutrients. So you deplete your soils very, very quickly of essential micronutrients. Now, currently global soil loss, depending on which set of geologists you listen to, is between 43 and 75 billion tons a year. Okay, and I'll put that in perspective for you shortly. But that's a hell of a lot of soil is just going straight down the creek. It's going out to sea. It's blowing away in the wind. You know, it's this really is the Dust Bowl era for the world in general. You know, and we're not on top of it. You know, some people claim they are by strip cropping and things like that, but they're not. You get a heavy fall of rain, it'll take 12 tons of topsoil off a single acre. So, you know, that's the sort of thing that's going on. And we're getting heavier falls of rain now, aren't we? So soil erosion is actually ramping up. It's not just mechanical perturbation that's causing it all. Now, the next thing to bear in mind is that the current diet of the world, this industrialized diet produced by big corporations, is actually very bad for you. In places like Canada and Australia, 3/4 of the population now die from a diet-related disease. That is, you die by your own hand, and that is the hand holding the fork. 75% of our healthcare costs are linked to chronic diet-related diseases, whether it's diabetes or cancer or whatever. Obesity is rampant. You know, there are now twice as many obese people in the world as there are malnourished people. We still hear from the UN and FAO and people about the malnourished, but there's another form of malnourishment in obesity. And we could discuss this more in questions, but obesity is not just linked to overeating. It's linked very much to the chemical environment in which people are now living. And that's playing hell with their you know, their metabolic system. Diabetes, which is a symptom of a bad diet, is now the world's 7th largest killer, and you know, it's growing year by year by year. But the point I want to leave you with here is that this is not necessary. The rubbish that our children are being fed on is not necessary, and there are plenty of other ways to produce clean, healthy, safe food. Food deaths are preventable deaths, but you have to start in childhood. Okay, now we know that agriculture is the biggest killer of the lot. I mean, basically, it's responsible for the 6th extinction. 70% of large wild animals that were on the planet in the 1970s are now gone. We know that insects are vanishing, and with the insects are going the birds, the reptiles, the fish, all of those kinds of things. The current estimate is 66% of the world's fish are gone, and that 95% of the world's fisheries are maxed out, according to FAO. Now, I think that's a gross underestimate, because all the old fishing boats around the world have been bought up by China, and they are emptying the oceans willy-nilly. And on top of that, you've now got these super trawlers emptying the oceans willy-nilly. So the rate at which fish are diminishing in the oceans is way out of control. We've cleared about 55% of the planet's terrestrial surface. And the bits that we can't clear, we haven't cleared, are very often just high mountains or deserts where nothing grows anyway. So, you know, we're really into extremely narrow place with regard to the amount of land that we might have available to us to do agriculture. Now, clearly they're clear felling the Amazon and the Congo Basin and places like that for the sake of more agriculture. But that's a one-way street, because you change the whole climate when you do that. The Amazon is quite likely to go to a savanna and then to a desert once you remove the forest, because you remove about 1/3 of the rainfall. When you remove the forest, about 1/3 of all rainfall is actually locally cycled. It doesn't just come from the oceans far away. It's respired by plants and then comes down again. So people have ignored this. When you chop down trees, you remove rainfall as well. So the clearing of large land areas is devastating for, you know, the hydrological cycle, basically. The point I'm trying to make here is that the current model of food production, which is basically a Stone Age model. Agriculture was developed in the Stone Age. It has been pepped up with chemistry and engineering to become this highly productive machine. But chemistry and engineering, I mean, they're not sensitive to biology, and agriculture is actually a biological process. And what it means is we're now collapsing the life support systems in which agriculture resides. And that's a very dangerous thing. I mean, in other words, we've got a food system that is designed to self-destruct. And that's a worry. It means we can't keep on doing this for an awful lot longer. E.O. Wilson, the late E.O. Wilson, one of the greatest biologists ever, who wrote the book Half Earth, says we're tearing down the biosphere. And I think he's probably about right. Okay, now, of course, the world is cramming people into mega cities, and there are cities of tens of millions of people, astonishing numbers. Those numbers on the right there are the populations of certain big cities come 2050. So Mumbai is going to have a population, the size of South Africa, basically, or something like that. 42 million people in one city. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the pressure on the resources of that city, on the water supply, on the, just the physical resources and so on? But the point I want you to take away from this is there is no megacity, not one megacity on Earth, which can feed itself. They all import all of their food along enormously long, thin, and vulnerable food chains, which often stretch 5,000–10,000 miles. They stretch round the Earth, these food chains. And so these food chains are easily ruptured. These cities can easily fall into a shortfall of food. A big flood, a war, these kinds of things sever food chains quite effectively. And when that happens, the effects are almost instantaneous because of the just-in-time resupply system in the food chain. A big city like the one in the picture will run out of food in between 3 and 7 days, basically. And it will fall into absolute anarchy after about a week. So, activating that old Spanish phrase, there are only 7 days between, food sufficiency and anarchy. There's our human population, half of which is living in these cities now. There's nearly 4 billion people living in cities, is terribly vulnerable to any disruption in the food supply system that we've got. Okay, it's a tremendously wasteful system. So not only are we wasting topsoil and wasting water and wasting the lives of animals, we're also wasting that food in the picture. That's from the New York Times, and they based it on a USDA, US Department of Agriculture, statistics for, that's how much the average American family throws in the garbage every month. So, a complete shopping trolley of food gets chucked away by the average US household. And the numbers are very, very similar for Canada, for Australia, for any developed country around the world. That's not the people themselves throwing it. I mean, they're throwing, away the old pizza crusts and things, but a lot of that just gets shed during the food production pipeline. So between the farm and the factory, within the factory, between the factory and the wholesaler, between the wholesaler and the retailer, there are huge losses. Restaurants chuck away half their food. So there's an enormous drain on what is the most precious thing in that food? The nutrients. Okay, we are throwing gold in the garbage, and we can't keep this up because once upon a time, if you read the Odyssey, if you go back 3,000 years, there was a dung heap in Odysseus's farm outside his back door where they put all the kitchen waste and the crop waste, and then they would fork it back onto the paddock come springtime and use it to fertilize, the olive trees or whatever he grew. So that's 3,000 years ago. They knew about recycling and fertility back then. And, we've known about that all the way up until the 20th century when two gentlemen called Haber and Bosch, chemists in Germany, arose and decided that we should do this fertilization artificially by capturing nitrogen from the air and doing it chemically. Now, that's produced a number of problems, but let me just say in shorthand, there are real restrictions on how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash we can apply to the soil for various reasons. You can't just keep going, not the way we're going now. We will end up either poisoning the earth or running out of a critical macronutrient. So there is a real limitation on the world's food supply in terms of our ability to produce it and what we do with the waste. I mentioned about peak fish. It actually happened in 1994, and there's been a slight downhill slide in the FAO statistics. But FAO admits that the statistics for countries like China, Taiwan, Korea, Thailand, they're pretty ratty, because we're talking about thousands of small fishing boats. You know, we haven't got a very firm handle on it. We've got landings. We know how many fish were brought in, but it's still not terribly reliable. And we know that the Chinese fleet is probably at least a third larger than what they're saying it is. We knew that from that incident off the Galapagos, when about a third of the fishing boats carry no radio marker, radio beacon. So we are in a lot of trouble. We have mined the seas in barely a generation. We've emptied them. I mean, that's an incredible thought, that something as great as the ocean, you know, 70% of the planet could be just emptied of its key living resources in such a short time. And what it shows you, basically, the take-home message there is you cannot support an urban society using hunter-gatherer methods. And fishing is hunting and gathering. It doesn't matter how industrial you make it, it's still hunting wild animals. And you know, that's just not sustainable. You have to go to an intensive process if you're going to feed a city. It's the only way to do it. And the fish catch is, you know, is the canary in the coal mine there. That's what it's telling. And of course, we're ramping up the farming of fish to compensate for this. We've talked briefly about the climate. Now, the ideal climate in which agriculture arose was the Holocene, the last 9,000 years. But that is now over. It ended in about 1850, when we started to heat the planet by unlocking coal and oil and so forth. Now, if you look at the graph in the bottom right-hand corner, basically you can see what's happened with the average global temperature over the last 100,000 years. You can see it's jigged around through all the ice ages. It's been cold, -4, -6, pretty chilly place the Earth was. Then it comes up to the Holocene, that's the last 9,000 years, when agriculture arose. And look how small the jigs are compared to the rest. So the jigs are actually, you know, it's been a very, very stable time. And this is the point. This is the point. It's not a temperature of the Earth that counts. It's the stability of the climate. The flipping from one extreme of a drought to the other extreme of a flood. Now, that flipping is going to happen much, much faster and harder than it has ever happened before under the new warming regime. So the days of a stable climate for farmers are gone, and they're never coming back. Probably not, you know, while the human species remains. So we're into something which is entirely hostile to agriculture. So a farmer can suffer a drought and a flood in the same growing cycle. Okay, and this makes it very difficult to farm. So this is what is going to hammer, and it's already hammering agriculture. We're seeing quite large crop losses in the Northern Hemisphere as a result of the savage heat waves and drought. And, you know, the irrigation supply is drying up, the groundwater is drying up, you know, so really, you know, the climatic impacts are going to get bigger and bigger, and this is going to make it enormously tough. Now, the literature I've read says really from 1.5 degrees on, it gets very difficult to do farming at all. Obviously, in some latitudes, it's going to be a bit easier. I know Canada thinks it'll be able to keep on farming. I don't think it will, but, you know, not in the long run. But for the time being, when America is a desert, Canada will still be growing wheat. So, you know, that's okay, but above 2 degrees, and we're due to cross 2 degrees around about the 2050s, 2060s, agriculture becomes a total gamble. You know, 50-50 chance of a crop. Now, what bank is going to lend you the money to put in a crop if you've only got 50% chance of actually harvesting one? So those are the kind of questions that start to arise. If we pursue business as usual with fossil fuels, we're on track for 4 degrees by 2100, and that's just unfarmable, basically. You're talking about a climate that is so turbulent, so volatile, it's just not possible to grow things outdoors. So, you know, all of this really adds up to great instability inherent in the system of food production that we know and love and have cherished for 10,000 years. Now, just to put it in your mind, what I've just talked about, every meal you eat, right? So the lunch you had today, the supper you had this evening, that cost the planet between 5 and 10 kilograms of topsoil, that one meal for one person. 1.3 litres of diesel fuel was used to produce it, 800 litres of water, a third of a gram of pesticide, and it produced 3.5 kilos of carbon dioxide. Now you multiply that across 8 billion people and basically we're eating the planet. All the wasted soil and water, we're just devouring the substance of our earth. And this is the bit that people don't get because they don't, in the big numbers, they don't see their own personal impact. But this is the personal impact of every meal, however humble that meal is, even if it's just a bowl of rice. That meal for each person each day, 3 times a day, very often, is consuming those resources. Now, don't tell me that is a sustainable system. I've been hammering this point, you know, for nearly 25 years, and agricultural scientists still refuse to acknowledge it. I don't know why, they've got their head in the sand or something, but they don't seem to understand that agriculture is on a very short fuse here. So the bottom line is, you know, we love farming. It's a beautiful profession. Farmers are very wise, generous, and thoughtful people. I'm a great admirer of farmers. I've written about farming for over 50 years, and I love going on farms and talking to farmers about what they do. And I've talked to farmers on farms all around the world, 30 or 40 different countries. They all think alike, very similar. But unfortunately, they've now got this mechanized process that is gradually devouring, imperceptibly slowly, the resource base that they need to grow food. So it's becoming very difficult. And that's why many, many farmers, and I'll come on to this, many, many farmers are now seeking a new way to grow food. Okay, I want to talk now a little bit about what happens in history when food supplies falter and fail, because these are the lessons we need to absorb for the next 50 years. Okay, now the picture on the left is the world's oldest battle painting. Okay, it's between 16 and 17,000 years old. It comes from the Kimberley in Western Australia, from a culture called Gwion, a rainforest people. That's what it actually looks like. And basically what it is 2 lines of warriors, and they are chucking harpoons and boomerangs and throwing sticks at one another. Okay, now the fact that what they're using is not weapons, it's hunting tools. The fact that they're using hunting tools to try to kill one another, and the leader of one of them has just got killed in the middle, you might notice, he's Achilles in this particular conflict. And he's been hit in the face by a harpoon, and as well as clobbered with a boomerang, and a big kangaroo boomerang will knock down a man. So basically, you know, this is a conflict over resources, right? This is 2 perhaps different tribes or different families saying, you've got our waterhole, or you know, you've been hunting our ruse. So this is humans disputing over the thing that humans most traditionally dispute over: food, land, and water. Okay, so this has been going on nearly 20,000 years. It happened at a time when the sea levels were rising very rapidly. A third of Australia went underwater, and it's still underwater. So Australia lost a third of its continental landmass. It lost an area the size of Germany, France, Italy, Britain, Holland, you know, and Spain. That's how much land went underwater. No wonder the people were under pressure, and that traditional hunting areas and things like that, which might have held up for a while, cracked, and people came into conflict with one another. The megafauna in Australia, the giant animals, giant goannas, giant emus, giant wombats, giant kangaroos, disappeared. Hunted to extinction probably, also because of climate change. Whatever. This particular culture, the Gwion culture, also disappeared. Don't know why, but there was another Aboriginal culture in Australia at the time. So, all I'm saying is, you look back even into the Stone Age and you will find instances of humans in conflict over basic resources, food, land, and water. Okay, and it has been thus throughout the whole of history. So ancient Rome built its military might after it had defeated the Carthaginians in the Third Punic War and sacked Carthage, picture. Basically, they inherited the whole of the North African coastline, some of the best grain country on earth, stretching from Egypt to Morocco. They inherited all this grain, and that grain formed the backbone of the Roman trade, and it was taxed to form the Roman economy. And it was that tax that paid the wages of 55 legions who patrolled the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Now, a couple of times during the 2nd and 3rd century, big plagues came in on the Silk Road from China. Big plagues. We don't quite know what they were. Measles, perhaps, was one of them. But anyway, they took out a lot of farmers because farmers have very low immunity to introduce diseases because they normally live quite healthy lifestyles. They don't get city diseases. They don't get exposed to city diseases. So city people build up immunity. So the farmers were taken out. The grain didn't flow. The taxes were not paid. The legions were not paid. They mutinied. And in came the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and all of those people and took down the Roman Empire. So you can see how the Roman Empire was actually created as a result of food, of having inheriting a food bowl from the Carthaginians, and then it was destroyed by not having the revenue, that food bowl yielded. It just collapsed on itself, and many of the people who had been Roman legionaries became these tribes that then went on to raid and sack Rome itself. So that's basically the story of what happens. Food can build an empire and food can destroy it. And we are at risk of exactly the same thing happening. China has the same story in spades. The Ming Dynasty is quite a famous one that actually collapsed as a result of a series of rebellions that grew out of famine. So China, even though the population of China in those days was 100 million or something like that, it was a fraction of what it is today. The Chinese dynasties have always been vulnerable to famine. And there have been a lot of rebellions and revolts in China prompted by famines. Now, interestingly enough, the Vikings probably left Norway and Scandinavia generally propelled by the same famine that brought down the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was, I mentioned about the diseases, the plagues, the pandemics that brought it down, but at the same time there was a cold snap in the 3rd century, 3rd and 4th centuries. And the cold snap also made it very hard to grow grain. And, in Scandinavia, you don't have much of a summer. And basically, I think it was at that time in Scandinavian archaeology, all the villages start building defensive walls. So clearly there's a lot of raiding going on domestically. And eventually the young men just jump in this new invention, the longship, and they sail off in every direction to Ireland, to Iceland, to Britain, to France, to Germany, to Turkey, as far as Constantinople, down the rivers, into Russia, into Estonia, Lithuania, all those places were all Viking colonies. Kiev is a Viking colony. It's why the Russians and the Ukrainians don't get on today, because they're from different ancestral lines. So it's a really, this again, food is the trigger for these out migrations of aggressive young men. basically surplus young men who aren't needed to till the soil any longer because there's no soil or something. And they become raiders, basically. Now, fast forward to modern history, the 30 Years' War in Germany killed 7 million people because the food supplies were utterly destroyed by the Catholic and Protestant armies that just laid waste to Germany, which was then a country of several hundred principalities. It wasn't a country at all. Go forward to the French Revolution. There had been a series of famines, famous "let 'em eat cake" quote, which was probably not made by Marie Antoinette. But basically what happened, the price of a loaf of bread went up to the equivalent of a week's wages for a worker in Paris. Right? So you would have to spend your entire week's wages to buy one loaf of bread. No wonder the people got angry. So you get these revolutions. A revolution is when the people go hungry and then they start to sympathize with the radicals. The radicals are there in the background bitching and moaning all the time, but they never manage to stage a revolution until they get popular support. And what provides popular support? Well, when the people have not got enough to eat, that's what happens. So French famine followed by revolution, Russian revolution, 2 revolutions, followed by, which was actually arose out of several famines in the 1890s, the 1900s, shortages of food during World War I, and so on. They were the things that upset the common people enough to join with the radicals. We should remember in World War I that 1 million Germans died of hunger. I mean, probably twice that, 3 times that number throughout the whole of Europe, because everyone went hungry in World War I. But 1 million, up to 1 million Germans. Why? Because the Kaiser put all the farmers in the army and there was nobody there to grow the food. It was a really stupid move. But anyway, if you kill all your farmers on the Western Front or the Eastern Front, you're not going to have very much food. And of course, Winston Churchill was there with the Royal Navy, blockading Germany and making sure no food came in by sea. So the Germans blame Churchill for the famine, but in actual fact, it was their own lack of planning that caused the famine. But this is a very important thing in the German psyche, the fear of hunger. And we'll see where it gets us shortly. In the 1930s, Stalin, of course, declared war on the farmers, the kulaks as they were known then, a class war, because the kulaks refused to go along with this collectivization and stuff like that. And they made life very difficult for the commissars and so forth. So Stalin's solution was just to murder them or to transport them to somewhere where they couldn't do any harm, like Siberia. And most of them died. And again, in the Ukrainian war today, the Holodomor, the slaughter of up to 11 million Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians perpetrated by Stalin and his hench people, is still, behind the anger, and food is behind the war as well, and we can discuss that later on. But the echoes of these famines in the past and the conflicts that arose out of them are still with us today. China had the years of difficulty in the 1960s, created by Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward. Estimates of the number of fatalities range all the way up to 50 million. I don't know how credible they are, but certainly between 15 and 30 million Chinese died in those famines. They didn't overthrow the government because they couldn't. The government had all the guns, the Red Army. Basically, it was a disaster for the Chinese people, and it could happen twice. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. Pol Pot, interesting regime. He actually, like Stalin, he set about actually murdering the farmers. Farmers, engineers, people with any knowledge of how to do something useful were all beaten to death or shot. And so, food production in the Rice Bowl of Asia, which is Cambodia, collapsed. Something like an 85% reduction in the size of the Cambodian harvest, and 2 million people starved in that regime. So these are situations where in the past, food crises have either arisen as a result of conflict, or food crises have led to conflict. And this is my essential thesis, that food is not just a consequence of conflict, which is what you'll read in the academic literature, but it is also a forerunner and a predictor of conflict. So what was the cause of World War II? Hands up. Most people have forgotten. The cause of World War II, the primary Nazi war aim was to take Soviet grain-growing country in Russia and the Ukraine and Belarus and put German farmers on it and turn the Russian people off to starve to death. It was a specific plan called the Hunger Plan. It was run by the SS, the guy called Hermann Bach. So the whole reason that Hitler went into Russia, and he had to start, to get to Russia, he had to go through Poland. In the process of going through Poland, he incurred the wrath of England and France. So that's how World War II broke out in that part of the world. Go over to the Far East, you have Japan already in Manchuria in the early 1930s, and then turning its eyes to China. Why? Because Japan is resource poor. It's poor in all resources, including food. And so the conquest of Manchuria and northern China by Japan, and the ultimate, the starting of World War II by Japan, which starts in China in the late 1930s, 1936, 37, it is basically about feeding the Japanese people and putting Japanese farmers on Chinese land. So there was a plan to transplant 1 million Japanese farmers into Manchukuo, the Japanese Manchuria. So these are all examples of how governments are thinking in terms of taking other people's territory to feed themselves. And it is a consistent theme running through modern history. Today, in the last 50 years, 66% of all conflicts have been driven at root by arguments over food, land, and water. So 2/3 of the wars in modern history, particularly in Africa, have been driven by arguments over food, land, and water. So the arguments can be between different political groups, different religious groups, different cultural groups, but the root cause is they ain't got enough to feed their kids, so they've got to take out the next group or the next territory in order to reassure themselves. So looking around, the current Syrian crisis, or it's still bubbling on, basically it started with climate change. It started with 1 million farmers being pushed off the land by climate and moving into the cities where they made trouble. And, basically there was an internal revolt, but it was triggered by the fact that Syria is ground zero. It's been clear-felled. It's a desert country today, when it was once upon a time one of the most heavily forested and fertile and green countries on earth. You go back 5,000 years to see that. But anyway, once upon a time it was, but that whole Middle East now is just a desert, and it didn't used to be. Yemen was one of the most prodigiously fertile countries, but look at it today, it's a wasteland. Why? Because the Saudis, backed by the Brits and the Americans and others, have destroyed the agriculture and the infrastructure in an utterly ruthless, cruel way. And it's created a famine and the resultant plagues and things like that that go with it. Darfur, we could talk a lot about Darfur, because it is a breakdown between a traditional system in which farmers and graziers had an agreement that the farmers supplied the grazing and the graziers supplied the fertility, the dung. And that lasted for thousands of years. But the wheels came off, about 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And, particularly with population growth and things like that. So that then led to the civil wars, which have been pretty much unending since that time. And there's a brief list of other conflicts in Africa and elsewhere that are still ongoing, primarily driven by people disputing over not enough food, land, and water. Now, in my book, Food or War, I've identified 7 regions of the world which are at particular risk of conflict, including and up to nuclear conflicts. One of the most likely is in South Asia. India and Pakistan have been at daggers drawn over the Indus Valley for a long, long time now. They're both nuclear armed. They could have a small nuclear war. if they had a small nuclear war, this map shows what the temperature differential would be. So the Canadian wheat belt would be down by 2 degrees. What that actually means is quite a lot more winter kill. So lower yields, much lower yields in Canada as a result of a nuclear war in Asia. China's just downwind, so China would cop most of the the fallout. So the Chinese food supply would be heavily impaired. As you can see, around the world, there would be a nuclear winter lasting 10 to 20 years in which world food supplies would be severely curtailed. And up to, according to the scientific papers I've read, up to 2 billion people die of hunger. So people would be dying of hunger in Europe and North America, not just in Asia. So these are the things we need to think about. We need to think about them in the context of the Ukraine, where I think Vlad thinks he can get away with a small nuclear war. We need to think of them in terms of all the other possibilities for a nuclear war, including if China runs out of water and 300 million Chinese relocate into Russia, there could be a nuclear war there. There are American defense papers that identify that as a potential flashpoint between Russia and China, although they might be, matey-matey at the moment. Nevertheless, a scarcity of water in China could trigger a big movement of people. So North China and Northern India are the two most water scarce, heavily populated regions on Earth, the place where a food collapse could come quite quickly if the water runs out. Another one, obviously, you've got sub-Saharan Africa with the migrants moving north into North Africa. North Africa is on a knife edge. And if the whole lot goes, then there'll be 100 million Africans migrating into Europe, and Spain, Italy, and Greece will just simply disappear. So, if Africa is heading for a population of 4 billion people, and if that eventuates, then there probably will be large-scale famines. And, you may well see migration movements in the hundreds of millions. And just to put that in context, every year now, 1/3 of a billion humans leave home and move to somewhere that is more secure in terms of food and general living. Okay, 1/3 of a billion, 330 million people. So at the moment, 86 million of those are refugees, but the rest are economic migrants coming out of particularly India, China, Pakistan, places like that, and moving to Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, and Europe. So we've already got 1/3 of a billion human beings on the road. And the World Bank and others have warned that could easily go to 1 billion people. And when you get 1 billion people moving, conflict is not far behind because people resent strangers. So the only way to prevent that is to actually feed them successfully where they are. And we've got to think about how to do that, and I'll come to that. So anyway, we've got these flashpoints all around the world where there is a danger of conflict over food, land, and water. Now, let me just point something out about the human species. Basically, all of us are spending collectively $1.8 trillion a year on nice, new, shiny weapons. The total global budget for agricultural and food research and development is $70 billion a year. So that makes you the proud members of a species that spends 25 times more on better ways to kill itself than it does on better ways to feed itself. So there's an enormous pool of surplus cash there, $1.8 trillion a year going into weapons. If you spent just 20% of that on propping up the food supply, you would A, reduce the number of wars, B, have more food to eat, and C, you'd avoid this risk of mass migration. For those who say, oh, can't do that, we can't cut the military budget, bullshit. The military budget between about 1995 and 2005 was cut by 40%. When the Cold War ended, military budgets shrank by 40%. So people who say you can't cut it are just lying. So it's perfectly possible to transfer some of that money to a sustainable human future. in whatever form. Okay, well, that leads me to my central point that if you want peace on Earth, the best way to do it is through food. So if we invested 20% of the world arms budget, that's about $1/3 of $1 billion a year, $1/3 of $1 trillion a year, sorry. Yeah. First of all, you would feed everybody. There would be no more hunger on Earth. Secondly, to do that, we would have to recycle all our nutrient waste and our wastewater. That's perfectly possible to do. Singapore's doing it now. It's technically easily within the, so cities like Ottawa and Toronto and Sydney and Shanghai and so on, just simply have to catch all of the nutrients that they currently throw away and recycle them back upstream into farming or other forms of food production. And again, all the water that falls on the street and gets mingled with dog turds and things like that and goes down the gutter, just recycle it like they do in Tokyo. So, there's lots of solutions. There are lots of technically feasible solutions that can be done right now to prevent hunger, mass hunger, and also to prevent 2/3 of the wars that are currently fought over scarcity of food, land, and water, to prevent tidal movements of refugees and migrants, and to basically sustain humanity until we can get the population back down to what is a sustainable level. And if you do this, if you grow food in these ways or produce food in these ways, you're going to have a much healthier diet. You're not going to have this industrialized Henry Ford crap that the American system has put on our plates. You're going to have fresh, healthy, clean, uncontaminated food produced by a number of systems, which I'll detail shortly. And if you do that, you can turn half of the world's currently farmed and grazed area back into forest and grassland, and you can end the 6th extinction. So this is a very important moment in history when we can choose to go away from war and towards sustainable food. Okay, now there are 3 pillars to this whole process. The first one is regenerative farming. Some of you may have heard of Joel Salatin. Basically, he's a regenerative farmer from the US. Now, regenerative farming restores the soil. It basically locks up, carbon in the soil. It's got a better relationship between crops and livestock. It's much kinder to livestock. It produces clean, healthy food without chemicals or with very few chemicals, and it looks after the environment in which agriculture exists that supplies the context for agriculture. Now, it doesn't have to be low tech. You don't need to have open-toed sandals to do this. You can use robots, plenty of room for robots, driverless tractors and, what have you, aerial sprayers, all kinds of things, harvesting robots. I like the little robot in the top right-hand corner, which moves the electric fence. It's a New Zealand development. So to keep the cows grazing on new grass all the time. So there's lots of room for advanced technologies, including AI, in regenerative farming systems. Okay, and we can produce 1/3. Currently, agriculture produces 95% of the world's food. My target is we should produce 1/3 of the world's food from regenerative agriculture. And you can produce a heck of a lot of food in cities simply by recycling the water and the nutrients. And here are some architects' ideas of how you might do this, what these cities might look like. But basically, they are green cities, and they have things known as sky farms in them, which are tall buildings which are recycling their internal water and nutrients, and they're producing a lot of food, as well as a much greener, healthier, nicer environment for their inhabitants. I love the one in Singapore, which is an architect's design for an old age retirement village. So, when you've become a useless old bastard like me, you go into one of these places and you grow your own food and you chat to the neighbors and you eat fresh, you eat healthy, you stay exercised. When you're 80 years old, you become a farmer, and so there are concepts like this. New York, there are farms springing up all on the roofs of the buildings along the Hudson. So it all started with Stefan Buri in Milan with the vertical forest idea, which is now spread to 6 Chinese cities, putting trees up the side of skyscrapers to clean the air, use the water, use the nutrients. A lot of those trees produce fruit and nuts and things like that. So, you know, the concepts for greening the cities are limitless at the moment. There is a whole revolution in urban design coming forth at the moment, which of new ways to produce and sustain food. Now, basically, the average city could grow or produce half its own food within its urban area. And, you know, here are some of the methods, obviously hydroponics. The one up the top, basically they're growing herbs over a big tank of water, which is producing barramundi, the fish at the bottom. There are, you know, tomatoes and things like that being grown in enclosed farms, covered farms from Norway, you know, through to the Australian desert. And they produce huge yields of clean, uncontaminated, you know, there's no pesticide, fresh food, very good to eat. And the nutrients are supplied to them every day according to the needs of the individual plant. So, you know, and there's a massive ideas for how you do this. So these are all designs for various forms of aquaponics and aeroponics and so forth, ranging from the backyard to the high-scale industrial aquaponics. We've had floating farms for a long, long time. In the Ganges, we've had them for thousands of years. The Aztecs had good floating farms when Cortez arrived. But now the concept is being redeveloped by Japanese architects, Singaporean architects, etc., etc. You know, if you're in a big city adjacent to the ocean and you don't have a lot of farming land in your hinterland, you can just plop it on the sea. You can use solar to extract and freshen seawater. So you've got fresh water to grow the vegetables and vertical farms and things like that, floating vertical farms, to create an entirely new environment in somewhere like Tokyo Bay. You know, an enclosed area, obviously, that's not subject to too much rough weather. But, you know, this is a sort of trend that is starting to take off. People are thinking of, but it needs investment. It needs venture capital, you know, it needs people to get behind it. Farming the deserts equally, you know. So that's Sundrop Farms in South Australia produces about 20% of Australia's tomatoes today. Everybody will have eaten, in Australia, will have eaten a Sundrop tomato without knowing it. And what they're doing with that solar is that they're purifying saline groundwater. The groundwater in that area of the desert is useless. Can't feed it to cattle because it would kill them. But you can take the salt out and you can use the water to grow tomatoes, wonderful tomatoes. So, you know, these are all concepts. So we can farm the desert. So places like sub-Saharan Africa, there is no need for them to go hungry. These kinds of concepts can actually feed them. Micro farms, you know, people are growing food on their balconies in high rises. There are some supermarkets selling plants that are still alive, lettuces and what have you, are still alive. You know, if you're a fashionable farmer, you can buy that little IKEA farm and stick it in your living room. You know, so there's all sorts of concepts now for small scale agriculture, including restaurants growing food on their roofs, hospitals growing fresh nutrient-rich food on the roofs of the hospital building to feed patients in recovery, and so forth. So the idea of the micro farm is taking off as well. Insects, big opportunities here. Why insects? Maybe you don't want to eat a cricket or a grub, but lots of people do, in fact, and they're making, you know, wonderful desserts out of cockroaches and crickets and stuff like that now. But insects are very good recyclers. So all that food waste we talked about earlier can be chewed up by the insects, and you can then feed the insects to chickens or trout or anything else that you happen to be farming. So the insects can be part of the nutrient cycle. Now, big one, this is coming whether people like it or not. I know, you know, graziers whinge about it, but to be honest with you, meat produced without cows or without pigs is on the table now, and it's coming big time, and it's becoming more and more affordable. It'll be a fraction of the cost of real meat. And it is real meat, actually. It's grown from embryonic stem cells of animals, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and so forth. So that hamburger there, which is the experimental one produced in Holland, costs $350,000 to produce. So that's a bit expensive for your average hamburger, but they're now producing that meat for $3 a kilogram. That's how quickly this had advanced. So that was the first one. It was very expensive. But basically, this kind of food, I know a lot of people don't like it, but it's got low chemicals. It uses less than 5% of the land and water required to grow food agriculturally. That's the point to bear in mind here. Less than 5% of what agriculture requires. And it's going on in big, so we're looking now at a lot of food coming out of those big steel vessels called bioreactors. And we're also looking at a printer revolution. You won't buy a burger from McDonald's or Big Mac any longer in future. You'll buy it from a machine which will print it out for you. And indeed, you will have one of those machines on your kitchen bench top, and you will just put in the right ingredients and it will print out whatever you order it to print out. Now, I don't much like the sound of it, but it's coming. And a lot of people are going to take to it the way they do to any new technology. So, food printers, are realistic things. About 30 companies on Earth at the moment producing them. So they're taking off there. But one thing I would like to leave you with, and this is courtesy of Dr. Bruce French, an Australian agronomist who's compiled a list of all the edible plants on Earth. And his list is currently 30,500 long. Now, if you look at the whole of the major industrial diet of people around the world, it contains about 200 to 300 individual plants. So humans are currently eating less than 1% of the available edible plants on Earth. So there's an absolute cornucopia of wonderful new culinary and health-giving experiences ahead of us by just simply looking to nature for some of the things we don't eat at the moment. Deep sea farming, it's essential. A cubic kilometre of ocean can produce a hell of a lot more protein and carbohydrate than a square kilometre of farmland. Think about that for a moment. It's 3 dimensions. So it really saves space. If you can move your farms off the land and into the deep oceans, use all those unwanted old oil rigs and things like that as farming centres and things like that. We're going to have to do this. We're going to have to turn the waste nutrients we produce into seaweed and algae and microalgae and use them to feed fish. Because take it from me, fish don't eat soybeans and wheat. That's a stupid diet for fish. You feed them on seaweed. And you can grow seaweed just about anywhere using waste nutrients from our current food supply. So, this is entirely doable. So these 3 things, regenerative farming, deep sea farming, and urban food production will each supply around about 1/3 of the world's food needs in time to come. Okay, so this is a bit of an overview of algae. It's taking off everywhere at the moment. Water cropping is the next big agricultural revolution. I mean, algae, you can make anything you like out of them. You can make your t-shirt out of them. You can stick them in your Toyota 4-wheel drive and drive away as oil. You can just squeeze an algae, produce the oil and put it straight in your diesel fuel tank and drive away on it. So it's fresh, clean oil. It doesn't pollute because it pulls the CO2 back down again. Okay. So, and of course, algae are healthy to eat, certain of them. Some of them have to be avoided. But it's a whole new industry opening up worldwide now, and something like 40 million tons of algae being produced at the moment, and that's only a fraction of the potential. Now, if you do all that, as I said, we can turn a lot of our farms back to nature, and there are many, many farmers that I've spoken to around the world who would like to do that. I've seen it in Mongolia, I've seen it in Thailand and Asia, I've seen it in Australia, seen it in Africa, New Zealand, the kakapo on the bottom right-hand side. That Thai lady is a professor of microbiology, but she's putting the hornbill back because the hornbill shits seeds and spreads the jungle. so it's a keystone species in jungle, in Southeast Asian jungle. So you know, there are lots and lots of projects like this worldwide. These people need our help. They need to be paid to restore the world. How do we pay them? Out of the arms budget, right? $50 billion a year would do it. If you paid all of these people to put wild world back, you've ended the extinction crisis. Okay, we can, as I say, we can replant an area the size of North America without losing food security if you follow the methods that I've been speaking of. But we need to teach our kids how to eat safely, healthily, cleanly, and to recycle things. We need to teach them a new respect for food. The respect that my grandparents had, and yours probably did too, you know. Empty your plate. Don't waste. Don't waste anything. If you teach them respect for food, they will end up like the kids on the left, not on the right. Okay, on the right is the result of bad industrial nutrition, and it's pandemic at the moment, and it needs to change. Now, we need a year of food in every junior school on the planet, and by that I mean food being taught in every single class, not a special new class. I mean, but food being taught as a part of physics, geography, languages, sport. You know, every single thing you learn at school should have a food message in it about how to eat healthily and sustainably. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we wish, we are coming into a vast new age, the age of renewable food. The renewable food revolution is bigger than the renewable energy revolution. It will create more jobs, more companies, more businesses, more opportunities, more enterprises, more health. It will help restore the earth. It will help to fight climate change. It will help to heal many of the diseases that we now die of. It will end hunger in the hungry countries. It will help to prevent the things that start wars, and it will restore the earth. Thank you very much indeed.
Interesting.
Well, Julian, that was absolutely fascinating. One of the ways that I can tell that it was is that people were so intent on what you were saying that I have very few questions lined up. So I'm going to start with a couple myself while I'm waiting for some other people to chime in. I'd like to ask first about the destruction of the global food chain that has been exposed by what's been going on in Ukraine. I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, I would like to point out that in the conquests of Peter the Great and Catherine and various Russian monarchs of the past, there was always a desire to go south, first of all, to take on the Turkish Empire, but in the process, they acquired a lot of farmland in the Ukraine, which they tended to start regarding as Russian, even though I point out to you, these people have racially different origins. The Russians are Slavs and the Ukrainians are Vikings. So you know, obviously a bit of a mixture, but you know, the cultures arise in quite different ways. So they're not necessarily the same people. But certainly when the Bolshevik Revolution came about, the Ukraine and everything was regarded.
We're alive.
The Ukraine was regarded as a key part of the Soviet grain bowl. It produces roughly the same amount of food in a much smaller area as the whole of Russia. So I would say that one of the undeclared motives that Putin has is to enrich himself by capturing this huge resource, which produces 40 billion tons of grain every single year. So, and most of that grain is exported from the Ukraine. It's got a vast export surplus. It's the second largest grain exporter on earth. Not many people know that. For a small country, it does pretty good at its farming and its exports. So no wonder, you know, that's one of the motives. So it's not just pure conquest that he wants. He wants that to add to Russia's food security. So it's the old motive of food, land and water, you know, prying away at the human consciousness and the desire to invade and take other people's territory. So that's one thing, but obviously this has disrupted world grain supplies no end. It's taken about 30 million tons a year off the world market. And that's upset everybody, but particularly in North Africa, which is a major client of the Ukraine, but also places like China. China is the biggest grain export market for the Ukraine. So they've missed out here too. They're probably not too happy about that because it's pushed up the price that they have to pay to import grain from Canada or anywhere else that they may get it. So, you know, this is a lot of knock-on effects from strangling a decent sized grain producer like the Ukraine and capturing all they've taken 4 out of the 5 export ports, and those 4 are now lying idle. They're not exporting grain, or if the grain does go out, it gets captured by the Russians and used for their own nefarious purposes. So basically, you know, it's crippled the Ukrainian grain exports for the time being, and that's set up a series of shockwaves around the world, and it's driven up the Chicago Grain Exchange, which rules the world price. You know, so that's why we've seen this sudden peak in food prices. It's just coming off the boil now that people have realized that it's not as disastrous as we thought it was. But coming on top of it, of course, is the climatic impact of what's happening in Europe, the western part of the United States, China. I mean, all of these countries, Pakistan and northern India, they've all been hit to leg by the climate. So that's probably going to bring on a new round of world food price increases.
Yeah, so this is in addition to the inflation that's been caused by disruption of energy supplies from Russia.
Yeah, everyone talks about energy. Nobody talks about food, you know. But food is much more important than energy. You can go a long time without energy, you know, but you can't go very long without food.
I wonder when Xi Jinping is going to realize that situation.
Well, you know, China knows it's on a knife edge. I'll give them credit for that. They have been expanding into West Africa, Southern Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Chile, Canada. You'll find Chinese investment in agricultural farms and food processing companies absolutely everywhere in the world that allows it. You won't find much in the United States because they're a bit chary of that, but most other countries welcome Chinese capital coming in and taking over their industry. I mean, you drive through New Zealand, you see big factories with Chinese writing on the side of them. The dairy factories are now substantially owned by the Chinese. So China is taking precautions, but I think the thing that they have underestimated is the danger of running out of water in the north of China, the North China Plain, which is their main wheat growing area, where something like 75% of the groundwater, which is brought up to the surface to grow wheat and vegetables, that's already depleted and it's never coming back. So they're in an awful lot of trouble with regard to water in the north of China. South of China, they got plenty of water to grow the rice and things like that. So unless the climate changes violently, they're okay. But you could see, as I say, major hunger starting to appear in northern China. You know, if there's a bad monsoon, for example, most of the rain there originates with the Indian monsoon. So, you know, they're on a knife edge. So that's why I nominate them as one of the places in the world that's at risk of conflict and mass migration if they don't get it right.
So related to that, you had said something about the conflicts between India and Pakistan, and I'd like you to comment, if you can. What do we know about the situation in particular in Karachi, which is really a mega city? It's got over 16 million people, and they've just had this tremendous flood, which has covered most of Sindh, destroyed large areas of the country, and probably all of their food supplies.
Yeah, everybody's very focused on the climate impacts on that flooding. and they rightly should be, because the more heating we do with the more fossil fuels that America and Canada and Australia mine and burn, the worse the climate is going to get for the Pakistanis, and they're already in a semi-arid climate. But the other factor that has gone unremarked here is the fact that Pakistan, that region, has been farmed for 4,000 years, as I mentioned. It's been farmed for a hell of a long time. The soils are very exhausted and depleted. And they have cut down every single tree as far as the horizon. So over 4,000 years of civilization, they've completely deforested it. Now, when you deforest a country, you get big floods. Big floods are a consequence of not having trees to hold back the water so that the water can sink into the soil. When you have a well-forested area, the water goes into the soil and it builds up the groundwater underneath it. But when you cut down all the trees, first of all, you get massive floods. The runoff is very, very quick, and you don't get the soil recharged. Even though there may be a flood running over it, the soil doesn't get recharged because the flood's too quick. It's good, here and gone in a couple of weeks. Whereas if you've got a forest there, it sinks into the forest floor, and then your aquifers are recharged. So you're not going to see aquifers, like the Ogallala aquifer in the middle part of America. You're not going to see that recharged in our lifetime, or in anybody's lifetime. In fact, that water is just being sucked out forever now, and the same applies on the North China Plain, and the same applies in North India. The groundwater is gone. The same applies in North Africa. There is no country on earth that uses groundwater that isn't mining it to extinction. So it's very finite. New Delhi, which depends on groundwater for its drinking, has only got 2 years left, and New Delhi's got a population of 25, 26 million people. So there are whole cities that are at risk from this, as well as farming areas.
Okay, thank you. Mike Nickerson, you're going to be first for questions, and Anitra Thorog, you're on deck.
Okay, well, thank you, Julian. It's been fascinating. I'm very much interested in full cycle nutrient management, and I'd worked up a question, and then you touched on it in several ways. I'm wondering what trends you see in terms of that being adopted as a mechanism.
Well, not enough, and I'm sure you would agree with me. There's just not enough focus being placed on it, either scientifically, how to do it, or technically, what are the practical realities of doing it within a city? How do you turn a city from being a nutrient waster to a nutrient capturer? And yet you think of it, all the nutrients that come off our farms flow through these giant cities. But they go into the groundwater, they go into the sewage, they go into the garbage tip. So they're all wasted. They all go to waste. We'll never see them again. In the garbage tip, they're mingled with some horrific poisons, so that they're unusable. If they go into the river, they end up in the ocean, and they're on the bottom of the sea, and we'll never see them again either. So we are depleting the entire planet of these nutrients. And that's a very, very dangerous situation. So we need to go back to the old style of thinking, the one I illustrated with the story of Odysseus. We need to recycle those nutrients, and they are more precious than gold. They really are. That's what keeps us alive. Gold does not keep us alive. Money doesn't keep us alive. Nutrients and water are the two things that keep us alive. And if we run out of either, we're in a bad way. So this has to be a part of the thinking of everything we do. Everyone who designs from now on a house, an office building, a factory, has to think about, how do I recycle the wastewater and the waste nutrients? And we've built this waste-based society, thanks, as I say, to Mr. Harbour and Mr. Bosch. Farming is not farming any longer. Farming is mining. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Farming destroys the soil fertility on which it depends. If it replenishes it with phosphorus and potash, it still depletes micronutrients, which are an essential part of your diet. I mean, why are so many people getting bowel cancer these days? The answer is missing micronutrients that just aren't in the diet any longer. So basically, because our soils are so depleted. So a lot of human ills arise from nutrient depletion. But let me once more refer to, if you look at the global boundaries figure developed by Rockstrom and Stefan and co, you will see that we have exceeded the safe human boundary for a number of things, such as extinction and so forth. But the one we've really exceeded it by is nitrogen. We are pumping far more nitrogen back into the global biotic system than it naturally carries. And this is leading to, tremendous poisonings, basically, to ocean dead zones, to pollution of rivers and lakes, so that the water is just undrinkable. The nitrogen overproduction is one of the most dangerous and destructive elements of agriculture. Yet everyone is saying, oh, well, we can double the food supply easily. All we have to do is double the amount of fertilizer we put on. Well, if we do that, we will destroy agriculture. It's simple, we'll certainly destroy water. Whereas if we recapture the nutrients and just reuse them, you're using a finite amount of nutrients and reusing them. And that is the safe way to go. We have to stop mining and stop polluting. So that mining is not an answer. You cannot have an agricultural system that is a mining system if you're going to sustain the human food supply.
The process of full cycle nutrient management is easy to imagine in Ulysses' situation. He just took it out to the field. Here in rural Ontario, it's easy to imagine. In the cities, it's very hard to imagine. As we move into this new time of change, can you imagine that the trend towards living more in cities and will reverse, and people will head more to the natural world where they can in fact recycle nutrients?
Well, I'm not sure of what you say, because there are some very good examples around the world of people who are starting to harvest their nutrients. Now, just imagine, for example, here where I live in Canberra, we have a green bin in which we put all our organic waste, so our garden clippings and our kitchen waste, and that goes to a place where it gets reprocessed into soil and fertilizer and stuff for organic farmers and things like that. You can recycle all of your green waste, basically. The Dutch are already doing it. They're doing it in parts of Britain. So there are local councils who've already got waste recycling systems set up. There are some in the United States, actually, in local communities, but it's not being done large scale. It just takes one big city to pick up the challenge and show how it can be done. So that's one lot of nutrients. The second one is the sewage nutrients, okay? Well, there's gold in them sewers, literally and figuratively, because all the micronutrients you need to sustain the human food supply, we are shitting into the sewer system and sending to waste. So if you actually put a cap on the sewer and bring back all the nutrients, the biosolids and the effluent, you can, people are already using the effluent to grow grapes and things like that in Australia. But the biosolids, there's a bit of an argument about, because you have to isolate things like cadmium and various pollutants, mercury if it's there, arsenic if it's there. You have to take those out. Now, technically, that's feasible. It's expensive, but it's feasible. So, you can reuse your biosolids, which are forming mountains around most cities now. The biosolids is the solid part once you've taken the effluent out of your poo, your sewage system. So that can all be reused in various ways. It can be used, as I say, for soil amendments, for fertilizer, for actual making soils and garden cultivation stuff. So there's a lot of ways that you can recycle the nutrients. But apart from Singapore, which is starting to experiment with these things, I don't know of anyone who's doing it on a city scale at the moment, but it needs to start happening. I know of a number of cities, including Palestine, including the Jerusalem. There's all sorts of places where they're playing around with these ideas at the small scale, but they haven't really got the big scale yet. And that's why we need to take some of that defense money and put it into the development of these technologies. Now, this is an area that is more important than renewable energy. Here we are busy going for solar cells and windmills and God knows what. What we have to do is put it into recycling of nutrients, and the technologies are not beyond the wit of man. to actually solve. So, you know, it's an easy problem to solve compared to some. We
Thank
just
you.
have to, we need to demonstrate it, basically.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to go to Anitra, followed by Walter Knittel.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. You have a great talent for making very complex subjects understandable at a public level. But my question is, after we've heard all this bad news about the terrestrial biosphere, the oceanic biosphere, which you've mentioned several times, could possibly be one of the places into which expansion, even during climate change, occurs, because the water is much more conservative, especially, for instance, in the tropics in Southeast Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean Sea, where the variability is not very great. Now, you, of course, are going to counter me with the coral dying in Australia, but coral is a very, very sensitive tropical organism. And of course, it only has about 1 degree variability before it dies. But in Southeast Asia, they've done a great deal of both restoration of the ecosystems, which of course, the fishing, as you so well pointed out, is hunting, gathering, and restoration of the tropical nearshore ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass, of course, brings back, while stabilizing and making things better in terms of the ecosystem, it brings back a lot of the fisheries, which the simple people who live near shore sustain. But also mariculture, growing of plants, has become even more important than the fishery mariculture in Southeast Asia. It's gone 3 or 4 times above the shrimp fisheries and so forth. So my question is, if you were to look at the long-term uses of some of the seas as a supplement to, which of course you said is the sink of the nitrogen, the sink of some of the waste, how would you distribute that? And do you have an idea about what portion the nearshore seas could contribute to the horrible problem which you have just outlined?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Look, my potential solution to the food problem has got those 3 pillars: regenerative farming, that is farming that doesn't destroy its own environment; urban food production, which is either urban farming or else growing meat in large bioreactors; and the third one is deep ocean aquaculture or mariculture. And this is a relatively new field at the moment. Aquaculture is principally a coastal activity at the moment, and it is destroying its own environment simply because you've got fish packed into very small areas. They're producing an awful lot of detritus and refuse and feces and things like that. So you're seeing the Norwegian fjords and the Scottish lochs all being polluted by the salmon farms and things like that. And you've even got salmon farms in Patagonia that are wrecking absolutely pristine, seaways down there now. So these coastal aquacultures, there's a lot of chemicals used, just like there are in poultry farms, to keep the salmon from viruses and various parasites. Now, that's not, in my view, a sustainable form of aquaculture. It's making exactly the same mistakes in the water that we made on land, basically, polluting. However, you go to deep ocean aquaculture, and we're talking about a much more extensive process taking place below the surface of the sea, where you're not subject to cyclones and hurricanes and things like that, taking place in the ocean currents where nutrients are dispersed on the current, and again, using your recycled nutrients from the land, from cities and so forth, to grow microalgae, which then become the basis of your food supply to raise fish extensively, not intensively. So you don't pack them in like in a big chicken farm, you have a big net, as I say, a cubic kilometre in extent, in which you basically graze fish, as just like a large scale grazing enterprise, sustainable grazing enterprise on land. That way, you're not polluting anything. Your only input is the nutrients required to grow those fish, which are then converted into micro and macro algae of various kinds. And there are ways of growing algae, both of them, in the deep oceans. So you can grow the microalgae in large plastic bags, for example. You can grow macroalgae hanging on ropes and things like that, suspended from buoys, and so forth. But this area requires a lot of investment. I mean, we are in the same stage of deep ocean farming that we were in agriculture 10,000 years ago. We're just trying to figure out how to do it. But look, with science and with a lot of investment, it can happen quite quickly. I think it can happen. We can create a major deep ocean aquaculture by the mid-century, when we will really need it, and that it will supply up to 1/3 of the world's food. And it will do so from a tiny area compared to what we're currently taking up to grow animals and grain.
Thank you.
Okay, Walter, you're up now, and Lynn Oliphant, you're on deck.
Okay, great. Julian, excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned we should go to a sustainable level of global population or go down. The question is, what do you think that sustainable level is? That's question number one. And then the other thing that you talked about was robotics and AI and precision agriculture and all of that, which I'm very much into, and I'm into IoT. I'm just wondering if you had any sense of the efficiency of that type of agriculture in terms of, either cost or yield or, the amount of fertilizer, pesticides that you reduce. So those are my two questions.
Okay. The first one, just remind me again.
What do you think our global population go down to?
Okay, well, I answered this one in my talk a couple of months ago. Basically, and this is not my view, this is my reading of the various scientists who've done analytic work on this. Basically, a sustainable human population is around about 2 to 2.5 billion. That's what it was in 1950 when I was born. So that population at our current living standards, which are much, much higher. I mean, we're currently using 10 times the material resources that our grandparents used. The total human resource use is 101 billion tons of stuff a year. So that's what metals, timber, concrete, you name it. But 101 billion. It used in the 1970s, it was 29 billion. It's going to be 170 billion by 2050. So there's a horrific greed for resources buried in our, we've got to address that. And the circular economy is the way you address that. The non-material economy, you move to the ideas economy that depends on ideas and creativity, not on stuff. Anyway, so that's it shortly. But the bottom line is we've got to get back to a sustainable human population. If we don't, we are sentencing most of the human population to death. Let's be quite frank about this. People don't like mentioning the word population. It's a swear word. But, I got to say to you, we're way overpopulated for what this planet can carry in the long term, especially at these levels of demand. And I don't think you're going to, humans are naturally greedy creatures. Look at Vladimir. We're not going to get the demand down very fast, if at all, although we might start recycling our stuff so we're not ripping the earth apart any longer. But we can get population down voluntarily to 2.5 billion by about the middle part of the next century if we make family planning and education available to all the women of the world. The women of the world are already doing it, for heaven's sake. They've reduced the number of babies produced per woman from 4.4 to 2.4, since the 1960s. So there's been a dramatic fall in fertility, human fertility. and it's accelerating. And guess what, blokes? You're only producing half the sperm you did because of all the toxins in your environment. So men are becoming far less fertile as well, firing more blank shots, I suppose you would say. So there are opportunities to reduce the human population quite painlessly, just by offering women the choice. And women are doing this, I may add this, they are showing world leadership without consulting men. They've made this decision autonomously. Most of them didn't discuss this with their partner. They just said, I've had it with too many kids. Not too many pairs of shoes, too many school books. I don't want to go that way any longer. So if you leave women to make their own choices about their life, you will have a dramatic reduction. You will have a baby bust in the same way that we had a baby boom after World War II. So that was the first one. Now, you ask about AI and agriculture. Look, I'm not an expert on that, but I have seen, obviously, the application of AI growing and growing and growing in the last 30 or 40 years in different ways, or computers, drones. There's all sorts of technology that's coming forth to make the farmer's job easier. But I hope that technology is not going to be used as a pretext to keep on producing a poisoned agriculture. Agriculture puts out 5 million tons of toxic pesticides every year into the environment. Not all those pesticides go away, as they would like you to believe. A lot of them hang around. Some of them hang around for a very long time. Some of them break down into other products that are equally nasty, as DDT did before it. So when the Silent Spring was written in '62, the amount of chemicals used in agriculture has grown tenfold since that time. So we've got to get off that train, because using chemistry to grow food is a nuts game, basically. So if you can use AI to smarten your approach to chemical use, to increase your use of natural systems, insects, and so on to control pests, then it's good. But I honestly think that monocrop agriculture, such as has been designed by what I call the Henry Ford model of farming, which is the one advocated by America over the last 50, 60 years, is a one-way street. It's not going to make it. It's going to go down for the reasons that I explained in the talk. So we need to think in a much more integrated, holistic manner. And if AI can help us do that about food production, if AI can help us manage the nutrient flows in the big cities and so forth, then I think it's going to be a boon to us. But let us beware, because in my books I've talked about this. AI can also be our undoing. AI enables the powers of the world to spy on every single human being. By the time the quantum computer comes along, we will have the storage capacity to store data on you from the moment you're born to the moment you die. And this, more will be known about you than you know about yourself. So AI has got some downsides. If you create a system of global surveillance like that, people will be frightened to speak out. People, like, the Club of Rome, or myself, or the people who, David Attenborough, there are people talking about these things. They won't speak out if they're threatened by these powerful regimes and interests. So AI has some pretty dangerous aspects. I don't like the idea of AI being in charge of nuclear weapons, and it is in charge of them now. So, let's keep the uses benign, folk. But at the moment, there is absolutely no method of controlling how AI is used. So it can be used for purposes good and evil. And we need a World Technology Commission to look at all technologies, not just AI, not just nano pollution and stuff like that, but all technologies, to make sure they don't, like coal, arise to bite us.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. There may be a link to the last question, which will come from John Legg, but first we're going to go to Lynn Oliphant, and John Legg, you're on deck.
Thank you. Julian, I certainly agree with using our military budget in a better way, and I certainly appreciate your realization that we're in population overshoot. But when you gave examples of alternative food production, and many of the ideas that you were presenting, I think are very good, other than polyface farms, it seems like all the examples of food production appear to be high-tech, high-cost examples using science and technology simply to remove limits to growth, which this is business as usual as I see it. If we're going to grow our animal flesh in stainless steel tubs that have to be temperature controlled, and you can't feed it grass, that's a lot of stuff and a lot of energy to produce food compared to a cow that's out eating in the pasture. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'd like to see the actual analysis, because you've got to count all the photons that fall on the pasture and all the water that fed the pasture that fell out of the sky, and all the nutrients that nourish the pasture. I would say that if you assume that agriculture, because it's always been with us, is the sustainable answer to the future, I'd say that that's a dangerous assumption in the light of what is going down now with soil, water, and climate in particular. However, look, Salatin is not alone. There are millions of farmers like him around the world. There are thousands in Australia. I've been on the Soils Council here, and I know heaps of farmers who are really going to get back to that regenerative model. It doesn't, I'm just saying that the regenerative model doesn't have to be low tech. It can be low tech if you want it to be. It can be high tech if you want it to be. Technology has to serve the greater cause of helping to sustain the human food supply while the population is coming down. And I put it to you that the limit to growth is the scale of the human population explosion, which has actually taken place since the original Club of Rome report came out. This explosion in the numbers of people, it's still going on, and we've somehow got to get hold of that, or it's going to fix itself. Now, I imagine there's a few people here who know the story of St. Matthew's Island, which I think is off Canada or in the Aleutian Islands or somewhere like that. Anyway, somebody stuck 40 reindeer on it. Population blew out to 6,000. And then in 2 years, it collapsed to nothing. That's what we're doing to the planet. And that's the point of the Club of Rome's original report. We can't go beyond these finite bounds of our resources. We can be cleverer with our resources. We can recycle our resources. But at the end of the day, we've got to get our population down to a sustainable limit. Any farmer can tell you, if you put 2,000 sheep in a paddock that is designed for 500, you're going to have a lot of starving stock on your hand in no time. Any farmer can tell you that. Now, people can't apply the same lesson to humanity at large. They just think, oh, I'm going to have a baby. Well, we don't have to have a baby. And if you want to fix these problems, you've got to not have babies. So, and that's got to be acceptable to everybody, because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is devastation. Famine on a scale has never been imagined. So, it's by far the best option. So I put it to you that if we recycle resources and we get the population down, we start to get on top of most of these problems. But technology can play a useful role. But I, for one, want all new technologies to be policed to make sure that they don't drop us in the shit in the same way that coal has dropped us in the shit, in the same way that chemicals, the chemical problem, as you heard me say in the previous talk, is 5 times worse than climate change, but nobody's paying any attention to it. We produce 5 times more chemicals than we produce carbon emissions. So, and it's killing 13.7 million people every single year. It's the biggest act of homicide ever committed in human history, but nobody notices. So, there are things like that we have to get under control. But part of the answer is less people and recycle, so that the consumption has a much less impact on the finite boundaries.
Unfortunately, with all animal species, feed them and they reproduce. It's the imperative. It's the imperative of evolution.
No, that happens
Will
at first.
occupy whatever space you give them. And if we use technology to remove limits to growth, we grow.
No, when people are poor, they have lots of kids because they need the labor to support them. And you know, when countries get rich, people start eating a lot more meat, their demand for resources goes up, but they stop having kids. Now, you've got countries like Japan, which are very affluent, but their population has gone down by 12%. You know, and Japan's showing the way, but there are a lot of countries worldwide where the population is actually sinking, contracting by around about 12 to 15%. Go and look it up. I mean, basically, it's doable because there are many countries that demonstrate it right now. So, I mean, in Australia, and I imagine this might be true of Canada as well, if we did not have migration, our population would actually be contracting. You know, if we stopped migration right now, our population would stop. But of course, all the vested interest lobbies are desperate to keep the machine going, you know, to keep the growth machine, the imaginary dollars, all the bullshit, you know, the real estate, keep everything going, not realizing that it's going to be the ruin of us. So, but, you know, the thing is, if you feed people adequately, very adequately, and you bring them to a reasonable standard of living, they stop having babies. That's the point. And so this voluntary family planning becomes totally feasible. And as I say, it's already proven in a great many advanced societies. Many European countries are now shrinking in population and so forth. So it's doable. That's my essential message there.
I suppose that if there's a difference between Homo sapiens and the other animal species, especially the mammals, it's that we have the ability to do self-control. And perhaps there's some hope in our ability to do that. So our final question is going to come from John Legg. I'm going to slide over to the side and let Jean, who's been here the whole time, move into place so she can thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that really, I would call it brain exciting presentation. I have two questions. Most of my career has been in the Foreign Service, so you'll recognize that. Can you think of any other organization in the UN, the specialized agencies, other than, and I don't know much about it at all, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO in Rome, that may be in some way involved in discussing these issues that you've raised? And then the broader question, if believe it or not, is, have you looked so far down the road that you could visualize whether activities in the new agriculture, let's say all those methods that you've put on the screen for us and talked about, would be taken over by family and private, in other words, private sector or governments or international organizations? I mean, the easy answer, I suppose, is all three, but have you visualized who will be involved and what way? So the first one has to do with the, in the UN now, is there anything being done in the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome? And then the broader question, what type of categories of people would be involved in the new agriculture?
Right, well, yes, is the short answer. The UN has a number of bodies that are involved in the food problem in different ways. FAO is there basically to oversee agriculture. It's the Food and Agriculture Organization, and it does that statistically, and it still has the sort of philosophy that it had back in the 1950s, which is we've got to end hunger and produce more food. And I think that's a bit old-fashioned and out of date now. It hasn't quite listened. It's starting to hear, and different directors general show greater or lesser sensitivity to it. The message that the agricultural system, that we've got at the moment is breaking. And if we don't do something about it, we're in for a lot of trouble. So FAO needs to change its thinking. It can't think that agriculture is going to feed the world forever, because it's going to get a nasty surprise. However, you go across the road to the United Nations Environment Programme, and they're monitoring an awful lot of critical factors like, tree cover, forest cover, water availability, all of those kinds of things, materials use, materials recycling. UNEP embraces a tremendous amount of what you might call the impact end of agriculture. So they're doing much more creative thinking in that space. And then you've got lesser agencies in the UN, like the UN Convention Against Desertification, which is focused on how do you put, green, fertile areas back where humans have created a desert. And you've got things like the RED scheme, which is a UN sponsored tree planting scheme, basically to put forests back. And is a very good scheme, actually. So there's lesser schemes, and there's lots of them. I really can't enumerate them all off the top of my head, but there's a heck of a lot going on at the UN. But if I comment overall on the UN, I would say that the UN has a high awareness of climate, but a low awareness of the other 9 mega threats. So the UN has not really got the full picture, in my view. Bits of the picture are held by different agencies, and they can see that. But the UN as a collective and as a representative of the governments of the world doesn't seem to understand that the human species is in dire danger now of either a collapse in civilization or of actual extinction. And it needs to wake up fast. And I do think that Guterres, the Secretary General, is making all the right noises. He's highly aware that not enough is being done on the climate front, and he's getting more and more vocal, and more power to him. But the UN really hasn't, quite got there yet. But having said that, no government on earth has got a policy for human survival, with the possible exception of Bhutan, although it's not framed that way. It's framed as national happiness. But no government at the moment thinks we've got a problem. And that is a problem. Now, sorry, the second part of your question was about...
Looking way down the road, you see
yeah.
the private sector or governments or international organizations or all three, and what proportions?
Actually, I see the private sector, and by that I mean mum and dad enterprises, small business, taking back control of the world food system from these dreadful bloody corporate mega giants. These corporate mega giants have no interest in food. They're only interested in money. They're simply mining the pipeline between the farmer and the consumer for whatever they can get out of it, and pumping it into their shareholders' overstuffed pockets. So, they are like the oil companies and things like that. They are a critical part of the destruction of the planet. However, the urban food production, if you read Food and War and look at the detail of what's going on in urban food production, there is a multitude of opportunities for small enterprises in there. Corporate enterprises too, for visionary corporations. But the bottom line, one of the things I've learned from studying agriculture is that farmers, male and female, are bloody tough people. And even really hard times, they just tighten their belt and they keep going. And corporations cannot do that because they have accountants, and the accountants point out that they're losing money. Therefore, they better get out and go somewhere else to make money, because their shareholders expect them to make this fictional thing called money. However, ordinary farmers keep going through thick and thin. So small enterprises run by, as I say, families or small groups, small businesses and so on, are, in my view, much more resilient and much more suited to this kind of world that I'm envisioning. Now, horses for courses, as we say in Oz. Basically, if you're talking about a large-scale, deep ocean farm, I think you're talking about tens of millions of dollars there. If you're talking about a big sky farm, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars. I mean, they've just built one in Abu Dhabi. Emirates Airlines built one. It cost them $50 million. There's actually quite a big one in Toronto, I believe. Anyway, there are so if you're talking about a large structure with a lot of concrete and glass and other stuff, then you need a big investor. But to grow food in your backyard, you don't need a big investor. You just need a will and some knowledge and a little bit of technology. And that, I think, is the opportunity. So even in starving countries at the moment, if you put these intensive urban farms in there, individuals would start feeding themselves and feed their local community. So I actually think this is a real opportunity for small business to recapture the world from big business. I may be wrong, but I'm an optimist.
Thank you. Very solid answers. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And it is, again, my pleasure and my privilege to have the opportunity to thank you on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, Julian. This has been an absolutely fabulous presentation that you've given us, and it's the second wonderful presentation that you've done for us. So again, I would like to thank you very much for what you've done, and I look forward to the discussions that we'll pursue from this. I would also like to say for everybody who is looking at this that to look at our website, thecanadiancore.com, and on that you will be able to see how to look at this particular presentation when it's put up in another day or so. And to do that, you need to look at the Stay Informed section and look at all the new information that is being put on our website on a weekly basis, including the link to this particular presentation. And again, if you're interested in becoming a member of KCORE, again, information is on our website at canadiancore.com. So again, Julian, I would like to thank you. It was a wonderful presentation that you gave today. Thank you.
Thank you.